Dear friends, subscribe and hit the bell. Your support allows us to continue our investigations. On October 15, 1950, the air shimmered above the scorching concrete runway of Wake Island. This tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, lost thousands of miles from civilization, became the scene for one of the strangest meetings in the history of American politics. President Harry Truman's plane, the Independence, was already on its final approach, but the man for whom the head of state had traveled halfway around the world was in no hurry to approach the gangway. Douglas MacArthur, a five-star Army general, the ruler of the Far East, a man revered as a deity in Asia, deliberately delayed. He checked his watch, adjusted his famous sweat-soaked cap with gold embroidery, and sucked on his invariable corncob pipe. This was not merely an administrative delay, it was a challenge. For the first time in the history of the United States, a military commander made the president fly to him, rather than appearing at the White House on summons. When Truman descended the gangway, MacArthur did not salute as prescribed by regulations. He did not remove his dark aviator sunglasses. He shook the president's hand as an equal, if not as the senior partner in governing the world. In this gesture, in this single minute under the scorching sun, was concentrated the entire essence of the conflict that would soon shake the foundations of American democracy. This was not just a meeting of two men, it was a clash of two eras. On one side stood a modest, pragmatic politician from Missouri, embodying civilian control and the caution of the nuclear age. On the other, the last great Caesar, a man of the 19th century who believed in absolute victory, personal destiny, and his divine right to determine the course of history. MacArthur at that moment was at the peak of his power. He had just accomplished the impossible in Korea, turning the tide of the war with one brilliant operation, and his authority was indisputable. But it was here, at the pinnacle of fame, that the mechanism of his downfall was already beginning to unfold. This mechanism was hidden not in the machinations of enemies or in strategic errors, but in the general's very personality, in his colossal, all-consuming ego, which recognized no boundaries drawn on maps by politicians. To understand how one man could place himself above the state and almost unleash World War III, one must rewind time to the origins of this monumental character's formation. Douglas MacArthur didn't just choose a military career, he was born into it, like an exiled crown prince. His father, Arthur MacArthur, was a Civil War hero who received the Medal of Honor at 18. The father's shadow was long, but the mother's shadow, Mary Pinckney Hardy, was all-encompassing. It was she, Pinky, as she was called, who instilled in her son the idea of his exceptionalism. She lived in a hotel attached to the West Point Military Academy while her son studied, and ensured that the lamp in his window burned longer than those of other cadets. Douglas absorbed the conviction that he was born not for service, but for glory. He graduated from the academy with one of the highest scores in history, second only to Robert Lee. And from then on, every one of his steps was calculated to create a legend. He was incredibly handsome in his youth, and he knew it. He was incredibly brave, and he demonstrated it. In World War I, he would stand on the parapet of the trenches without a helmet, wearing only his cap and a scarf wrapped around his neck, defying German snipers. He believed that the bullet meant for him had not yet been cast. This feeling of invulnerability, bordering on mysticism, became his armor. But behind the hero's facade lay a deep, painful sensitivity. MacArthur physically could not tolerate criticism. Any doubt in his genius was perceived by him as a personal betrayal and conspiracy. He began to surround himself only with those who were ready to serve his cult, the so-called Baton Gang. These officers, fanatically devoted to him, created an informational cocoon around the general, filtering news and reinforcing his conviction of his own infallibility. By the beginning of World War II, MacArthur was already a living monument to himself. But it was the war that stripped him of the mask of a simple soldier and put on him the mask of a prophet. The catastrophe in the Philippines in 1942 could have destroyed the career of any other general. The loss of an entire army, the forced escape on a torpedo boat, the abandonment of thousands of soldiers to Japanese captivity. It was a disgrace. But MacArthur turned disgrace into an epic. Upon arriving in Australia, he uttered the phrase that became an incantation: "I shall return." Not "we shall return," not "America will reclaim its territories." I. He personified the war. The entire Pacific theater of operations became a stage for his personal crusade. His frog-leaping strategy, capturing key islands and isolating Japanese garrisons, was brilliant. It saved tens of thousands of lives. But every success he attributed to his genius, and every delay to sabotage by Washington and the Navy. He waged war on two fronts, one against the Japanese Empire, the second against the Joint Chiefs of Staff. MacArthur was convinced that Europe was a secondary theater, and the fate of humanity was being decided in Asia, and of course, decided by him. When he landed on Leyte in 1944, fulfilling his promise, he made the operators reshoot the scene of him emerging from the water several times to make it look majestic enough. This was not posturing for posturing's sake. It was an understanding of the power of an image. He knew that in modern warfare, a camera could be more important than a gun. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship _1_, Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's surrender. At that moment, he ceased to be merely a general. He became a ruler. The next 5.5 years were perhaps the most astonishing period in his life, and one of the most successful experiments in nation-building history. America gave him absolute power over the defeated country. He became the supreme commander for the Allied powers, but essentially a new shogun, a white emperor. Japan lay in ruins, physical and moral. Cities were burned, the economy destroyed, and Emperor Hirohito's divine status was shaken. MacArthur could have been a punisher. He could have drowned the country in repression. Instead, he performed the miracle of a liberal dictatorship. He understood the psychology of the Japanese better than any of his advisors. He insisted on not prosecuting Emperor Hirohito as a war criminal. He understood. If the nation's symbol were destroyed, chaos and an eternal guerrilla war would ensue. Instead, he used the emperor as a tool. The famous photograph, in which the giant MacArthur stands in a relaxed pose, without a tie, hands on hips, next to the miniature, formally dressed Hirohito, was a shock to Japanese society. It showed who was now the true master, but at the same time preserved the life of the old god. MacArthur imposed a constitution on Japan that was more progressive than the American one. He gave women the right to vote, abolished feudal land ownership, broke up the Zaibatsu cartels, and laid the foundation for an economic miracle. The Japanese, who had expected barbarian conquerors, saw a strict but fair father. They wrote him thousands of letters. They came out into the streets just to see his motorcade. He lived in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, drove to his office in the Dai-ichi Insurance Company building every day along the same route at the same time. He never visited Japanese villages, inspected factories, or communicated with ordinary people. He ruled from behind a curtain, as befits an Eastern deity. This isolation strengthened his mystical aura, but it also detached him from reality. In Tokyo, he was a king and a god. In Washington, he was feared and hated, but they could not touch him. His popularity among the American people was sky high. It seemed he had reached a peak from which it was impossible to fall. He rebuilt an entire civilization in his own image and likeness. But history does not tolerate stasis. On the Korean peninsula, divided along the 38th parallel, clouds were gathering. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean army, equipped with Soviet tanks, crossed the border and rushed south in an unstoppable torrent. For MacArthur, this was a complete surprise. His intelligence had slept through the invasion, just as 9 years earlier it had slept through the attack on the Philippines. South Korea crumbled like a house of cards. American troops, hastily transferred from Japan, soft from occupation duty, poorly trained and lightly armed, were pushed back to a tiny patch of land around the port of Pusan. Disaster seemed inevitable. MacArthur, who was already 70 years old, once again faced defeat. And again, like a phoenix, he rose. While Washington panicked and generals in the Pentagon drew evacuation lines, MacArthur conceived one of the most audacious operations in military history. Incheon. A port on the west coast of Korea with monstrous tides, narrow fairways, and high quay walls. An amphibious landing here was considered impossible. The chances of success were estimated at 1 in 5,000. Everyone, absolutely everyone, from fleet admirals to chiefs of staff, begged him to abandon the idea. But MacArthur was adamant. "We will land at Incheon, and I will crush them," he declared. He trusted his intuition more than depth charts. On September 15, 1950, the U.S. Marines stormed Incheon. It was an absolute, stunning success. The North Korean army, cut off from supplies, was trapped and routed in a matter of weeks. MacArthur once again became a national hero, equal to Washington and Lincoln. His genius was confirmed. Critics fell silent, and it was this triumph that proved fatal. The success at Incheon finally convinced the general that he was infallible. He believed that the laws of war and logic did not apply to him. UN troops under his command crossed the 38th parallel and pushed north, toward the Yalu River, the border with China. The goal was the complete destruction of the North Korean regime and the unification of the country. But here a factor that MacArthur arrogantly ignored came into play: the People's Republic of China. Beijing had repeatedly warned through diplomatic channels, if the Americans approached the border, China would enter the war. MacArthur dismissed these warnings as a bluff. At that very meeting on Wake Island, he assured Truman that the war would end by Christmas, and the Chinese would not dare to interfere. Quote, "Zero," he self-righteously declared. He did not know, or did not want to know, that at that very moment, hundreds of thousands of Chinese, quote, "one," were already secretly crossing the Yalu River, moving at night and camouflaging themselves during the day. They waited in the snow-covered mountains of North Korea, dressed in quilted cotton coats, armed with rifles and grenades, ready to snap the mousetrap shut. When the trap closed in late November 1950, it was a shock. The Chinese attacked in waves, ignoring losses, using whistles and bugles in the night, creating psychological terror. American troops, stretched along mountain roads, found themselves in cauldrons. The temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Weapons froze. Equipment failed. This was not just a defeat, it was a rout. The U.S. Army made the longest retreat in its history. MacArthur's pride was wounded as deeply as never before. He could not admit that he had been outmaneuvered by the peasant general Peng Dehuai. He could not admit a tactical error. Others had to be to blame. Washington was to blame for tying his hands. Here begins the most dangerous stage of the conflict. MacArthur demanded an expansion of the war. He wanted to bomb supply bases in Manchuria, in Chinese territory. He wanted to involve Chiang Kai-shek's troops from Taiwan. But most importantly, he began to talk about nuclear weapons. In his understanding, war was an absolute. In war, there is no substitute for victory. If the enemy is strong, all available means must be used to destroy him. The concept of, quote, two, which Truman and his advisors espoused, was for MacArthur an absurdity and a betrayal of soldiers' blood. He saw the world in black and white. Communism is evil that must be physically eradicated, here and now. In private conversations and correspondence, MacArthur harbored a plan that sends shivers down the spines of modern historians. He proposed dropping 30 to 50 atomic bombs on Chinese cities and military centers. But that was not all. He suggested creating a belt of radioactive cobalt along the Yalu River, a death zone through which no living creature could pass for 60 or 100 years. This was a scorched earth strategy of planetary scale. For MacArthur, it was a logical military solution, to sever Korea from China forever. For Truman and America's European allies, it was madness that would have guaranteed the Soviet Union's entry into the war and the beginning of a global nuclear apocalypse. The conflict moved from the military plane to the constitutional. President Truman tried to restrain the general, sending directives about the need for caution. MacArthur ignored these directives or interpreted them in his own way. He began to conduct his own foreign policy. He wrote open letters to leaders of veterans organizations criticizing the White House's policy. He gave interviews in which he stated that the restrictions imposed on him were unprecedented and led to the death of American soldiers. This was an outright rebellion. The general effectively appealed to the American people over the head of the elected president, urging the nation to support his crusade against communism and against defeatists in Washington. The last straw was MacArthur's letter to the Republican minority leader in the House of Representatives, Joseph Martin. In this letter, read in Congress on April 5, 1951, the general openly rejected the strategy of limited war and declared, quote, 1. This was an open political challenge. Truman understood, if he did not fire MacArthur now, the institution of the presidency would become a fiction. The military would begin to dictate policy to civilian authorities. This was a matter of the Republic's survival. The decision was not easy for Truman. He knew he was committing political suicide. MacArthur was an icon, and Truman's approval rating was at an all-time low. But the president showed an iron will. On April 11, 1951, the world learned the news. The legendary commander, hero of 3 wars, proconsul of Japan, was dismissed for inability to fully support the policies of the United States government and the United Nations. The way it was done was humiliating. Due to a leak to the press, the White House was forced to announce the dismissal at a hastily convened press conference at 1 in the morning. MacArthur learned of his dismissal from a radio broadcast during dinner. His wife delivered the news to him. His face, as eyewitnesses recalled, was stone, but he uttered not a word of anger. He only said to his aide, "Jeannie, we're finally going home." The reaction in the USA was like an explosion. Society was furious. Thousands of telegrams cursing Truman arrived at the White House. Some called him Judas and a drunkard. In several states, effigies of the president were burned. When MacArthur returned to San Francisco, 500,000 people met him. In Washington, he was given a triumphant reception. And in New York, the grandest confetti parade in the city's history took place. 7.5 million people came out into the streets to greet their idol. This was more than the city's population at the time. People cried, threw flowers, reached out their hands to him. It seemed he could march on Washington and seize power right then and there. On April 19th, MacArthur addressed both houses of Congress. It was his swan song, a masterpiece of oratory. In a deep, vibrating voice, without notes, he presented his vision of the world, his philosophy of war and peace. He spoke of war being forced upon them and that there was no other way but to end it with victory. In the finale, he recalled an old army song sung in barracks. "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." And like the old soldier in that ballad, he said with tears in his eyes, "I now close my military career and just fade away." An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him to see that duty. Goodbye. Congressmen wept in the hall. Many called this speech the best in Congress's history. But behind the emotions lay a cold reality. The Senate hearings that followed the dismissal revealed an uncomfortable truth. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, including heroes like Omar Bradley and George Marshall, unanimously supported Truman's decision. Bradley uttered the famous phrase, "MacArthur's strategy would have involved them in _5_." American society gradually began to realize how close the country had come to the brink. If MacArthur's advice had been taken, the conflict in Korea could have escalated into a nuclear catastrophe, in which there would have been no winners. MacArthur did, indeed, fade away. He settled in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, living in his own world of memories and unfulfilled ambitions. He tried to participate in politics, hoping for a Republican presidential nomination, but his time had passed. His style, his rhetoric, his imperial ways seemed archaic in an era of televised debates and complex diplomacy. He was a titan, but a titan of the last century. A man who could forge a nation from ashes, as he did in Japan, but could not coexist within a system of checks and balances. His figure remains one of the most controversial and captivating in 20th century history. He was a genius who could not distinguish his own greatness from the interests of his country. He was a liberator who ruled as a despot. He was a pacifist who hated war, as he often claimed, but was ready to burn the world in nuclear fire for the abstract concept of victory. His paradox is that his main achievements, democratic Japan and the salvation of South Korea, outlived him, becoming prosperous societies, while his personal ambitions crumbled into dust. The story of Douglas MacArthur is not just a biography of a military man. It is an eternal lesson about the nature of power and the dangers of charismatic leadership. In times of crisis, societies crave a strong hand, a hero who will come and solve all problems with a single stroke of a sword. MacArthur was exactly such a hero. But democracy rests not on heroes, but on institutions. On boring procedures, on subordination, on the ability to compromise. The conflict between Truman and MacArthur was a test of the maturity of the American system. The system withstood, proving that the pen signing orders in the Oval Office is stronger than the sword, even if that sword is held by the most celebrated warrior of the era. When we look at the events of those years today, we see striking relevance. The question of where the competence of the military ends and the responsibility of politicians begins remains open. The temptation of simple solutions to complex geopolitical problems has not disappeared. MacArthur's figure reminds us that talent and ego often go hand in hand, and that a person's greatest virtues can be the cause of their greatest mistakes. In his last years, MacArthur often met with young presidents, Kennedy and Johnson, warning them against a land war in Asia. The irony of fate. The architect of the Korean War became a prophet who warned about the quagmire of Vietnam. Just before his passing, in the spring of 1964, he was already a frail old man, but his eyes still burned with the same fire as they did on Wake Island. He died at Walter Reed Army Hospital, surrounded by his memories of the cries of seagulls over Manila Bay, of the smell of the jungle, of the cold of the Korean mountains, and of the endless loneliness of a man who always considered himself above the surrounding world. Let us return for a moment to that scorching strip of Wake Island. The president's plane takes off, leaving the general alone on the ground. At that moment, MacArthur was certain that he had won, that the little man in glasses could do nothing to him. But history judged otherwise. The plane carried away the future, while the general remained on the island of his past, great and terrible, frozen in the bronze of his myth, which he himself had so carefully created throughout his life. The lesson he unwittingly taught the world proved more important than all his military victories. No man, however great he may be, can be greater than the people he serves. And when the golden gleam of glory begins to eclipse reason, it is society's duty to say no, even if it means shattering an idol.